Hello, name's Cedar, and I'm back at it again with recording another audiobook. Actually thought about not recording the B7-2 stories because I saw that Ozone actually uploaded the Didophobia story, I believe, and he said that he was going to record the other audiobooks as well, that he hasn't yet. But I thought I do want to read the book myself, so I might as well record it and upload it, right? It's been pretty fun to do. It's just been a few weeks because I've been busy, but now I got around to it. To at least the first story of the B7-2 book, which is titled B7-2. What I'm gonna be reading now. Now this book is actually the continuation or the sequel to the B7 story from, I don't know what the book was called, but anyway, the story was called B7-2, obviously, is the sequel. And I'm just gonna link the audiobook from Ozone in the description, so you can listen to the audiobook of the prequel if you haven't already. And I guess I'll give you time to do that now, or to click off and do that, or read the story yourself, right? And I'm just gonna try to give a little summary of what B7 was about. So basically, there was a boy who really liked animatronic characters, and he liked them a lot. Something weird must have happened. Who knows? Psychosis, maybe. And he wanted to be an animatronic character himself, or rather, he believed that he was an animatronic. So, through his life, he was like, 9 maybe, when he decided to want to be an animatronic. No, not 9, younger than that even. And after 10, 15 years, he slowly changed his life and his body too, into being closer to an animatronic. And this is where the new story actually picks off. So we see what will become of him, because at the end of the B7 story, he actually gained consciousness again. Actual consciousness that did not believe that he was an animatronic. Anyway, do not know how much he knows, but that's what this story is probably going to explore. So, right, without any further ado, I'm gonna get into it. The voices were far away, but getting closer. They were like scratchy static, marring the clarity of a perfect melody. Until the voices had intruded, Billy had been floating in a sweet haze of sensation-free bliss. Now, the voices cut through that bliss, yanking Billy into a muddle of noise and pain. Billy threw up a hand, wanting to ward off the invading unpleasant feelings. His raised hand, though, brought even more pain. A sharp cutting sting. Billy gasped and opened his eyes. The pinpoint lights were blinding. He snapped his eyes shut again. The bliss was well and truly gone now. Billy's senses flooded with information. Even though his closed lids, he could see the spears of bright light. He could hear loud chatter and a few shouts combined with an insistent and grating beep, the patter of footsteps and the occasional metallic clatter. He smelled the pungent scents of bleach and disinfectant, and the acrid odor of urine, and the nauseating smell of overcooked vegetables, maybe broccoli and cabbage. He felt something pricking at the back of his right hand, but that was the least of the pain he felt. It seemed like nearly every nerve ending in his body was firing a barrage of throbs and aches and twinges. Everything hurt, and the taste in his mouth. Billy tried to move his tongue around, to erase the bitterness that was so powerful, and he had to swallow down a gag. But then he remembered that he had very little tongue remaining. Only the barest nubbin of tissue was able to wiggle around in his mouth, and it could do nothing to wipe away the caustic flavor. Billy opened his eyes again. Turning his head away from the lights, he blinked several times and looked around. He was definitely in a hospital. But why? Frowning, Billy dug through his distorted memories. He saw himself look in the mirror, gazing at his unnatural square face and his mutilated body. He saw the floor of his home, and he remembered lying on it, crying. He saw his neighborhood, and he remembered lurching through it, walking and walking. He saw a junkyard and an old compression, a system-wide pain that blotted out all his sadness and regret. The memory acted like a catalyst. And now his mind replayed his recalled experience of listening to the rumble of the big machine that bore down on the car he'd hidden in. That sound, for some reason, pulled him back into his identity. He instantly became aware of it all. He simultaneously integrated the personality of a boy whose play had turned into a years-long delusion, and of a man who had realized his horrible mistakes and had to face his remorse and self-hate. That compactor had been Billy's way out of all of this, his surrender. So, how did he... "Well, look who has joined us," a perky voice cried out. Billy turned his head towards the open doorway. A compact woman with short, strawberry blonde curls, heavily freckled oval face, busted up the side of the bed Billy lay in. The woman wore a bright blue cotton uniform. Maybe she was a nurse, glancing at the beeping monitors. She put a warm, smooth fingers against the back of Billy's right hand, and he could feel them. Why could he feel the nurse's fingers? As quickly as Billy had cycled through the mind pictures that reminded him of the last thing he remembered before being in this room, Billy's brain flooded him an awareness of his life. Instantly, Billy knew that he had prosthetic limbs. He knew he did. And although the limbs often seemed real to him, he wasn't able to feel anything with them. Billy lifted his hand so he could get a better view of his right arm. He groaned involuntarily when sudden dizziness and a knife-like pain made it clear that his head protested the sudden movement. "Careful there," the nurse said. "You've been through a lot. You've been unconscious a long time. You're going to feel discomfort and disorientation." Billy looked around, hoping to see the computer he'd used to communicate with after he'd had his tongue removed, but there was no computer. Yeah, he'd have to try to talk. He opened his mouth, but the words he wanted to say wouldn't come out. "Here," the nurse said. "Open your mouth. Your mouth has to be super dry." He reached over to a nightstand that Billy hadn't noticed when he'd looked around. Billy focused on the grey metal stand now. He saw it held a mustard yellow plastic pitcher and a couple of small paper cups. One of the cups held water and a little sponge on a stick. The nurse moved the sponge, pulled a straw from her pocket, and put the straw in the cup. She held the straw to Billy's mouth. "Go slow," she warned. Billy tentatively raised his head. This time, the room didn't spin as much, and the pain wasn't as intense. He used his lips to suck water through the straw. As he did, he glanced at the white name tag pinned to the nurse's uniform. The name was Gloria. When Gloria pulled the straw away from Billy and set the cup back on a nightstand, he said, "Thank you, Gloria." Or at least that's what he tried to say. What came out was actually more like Gloria. The K was off. It wasn't crisp and clear. It sounded like something stuck in Billy's throat. "Not bad," Gloria said brightly. Without a full tongue, you're going to have trouble with a lot of the letters. But don't worry. We'll get you set up with a speech therapist. That will help you out." Billy nodded, but he didn't care about that. He had so many questions he wanted answered now. How? He asked. What he really wanted to get out was, how did I survive being crushed in a car? But that was too many words. "I'm going to call Dr. Herrera," Gloria said. "He's been in charge of your surgeries and has overseen your recovery. He'll explain everything. You'll like her. She's super nice." Gloria leaned over and checked the line that was connected to the back of Billy's right hand. "Looking good," she said. "But if the line starts to bug you need anything else, just press this." She pointed at the button on a small remote control that dangled from a thick white cord over the railing of the right side of Billy's bed. Billy stretched out his fingers to make sure he could reach the button. He was in awe that his fingers were still there. Gloria walked around the bed and adjusted his covers, then patted his left leg. Billy widened his eyes in surprise. He could feel that too. How was that possible? "Just hang tight," Gloria said. "Dr. Herrera will be here in a jiff." A jiff turned out to be about half an hour. Billy was able to know the time because he could see a big black numbered clock on the wall above the nursing station outside his room. It was 1:42 p.m., obviously, because the sun was out. Then when Gloria had left the room, and it was 2:14 when Herrera walked in. Even wearing a baggy white lab coat over the same blue cotton uniform that Gloria wore, Dr. Herrera looked more like a Hollywood star than a doctor. Dark-skinned and black-haired, the 30-something tall, slender woman had large, deep-set, heavily lashed brown eyes, sculpted cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a full mouth with even white teeth. Obviously adapted with makeup, Dr. Herrera had accented all her natural, beautiful features perfectly. Billy thought that her smoky eye shadow and red lipstick made her look like he was ready for a photo shoot. He had never met a woman as stunning as Dr. Herrera. He'd only seen a woman like her on pictures or on TV. "Billy," Dr. Herrera said, with a smile as she approached his bed. "Wonderful to see that you're awake and alert." Dr. Herrera's deep, even voice was as warm as her eyes were. Billy, however, found himself tensing when she stepped up next to the bed, pulling a stethoscope from her pocket and put it to her ears. When she bent over and pulled down the neck of the baby blue thin cotton hospital gown he wore, he held his breath. He suddenly was aware that the gown only covered the front of him. He felt exposed and vulnerable, and he flinched as Dr. Herrera placed the hard, cold end of the stethoscope against his bare chest. In spite of the way Dr. Herrera seemed nice, her white coat and stethoscope and her title, Doctor, immediately brought up memories of Doc, the grizzled old guy who turned Billy into a monster. He'd discovered himself to be hours before he'd made his way to the junkyard. Billy knew that Doc had only done what Billy had asked him to do, but that didn't mitigate Billy's association of Doc with all the pain he'd gone through. Billy hated the idea of another doctor looming over him. He didn't want to be in a doctor's control. "The hunt sounds good," Dr. Herrera said, straightening. Billy exhaled in relief when Dr. Herrera stepped away from his bed and pulled out the brown vinyl chair, which was straight-backed and didn't look comfortable. Towards the foot of the bed, she placed a chair where Billy could easily see her without craning his neck, and she took a seat. "Okay," Dr. Herrera said. "Let's get you caught up on what's been going on. Sound good?" Still feeling intimidated and wary, Billy managed a nod. He needed to know what had happened, so he forced himself to stay calm and listen. Dr. Herrera clasped her large hands together. Okay, Dr. Herrera said again. She said the word with a long O sound. Okay. Dr. Herrera opened her mouth and then closed it. Perhaps we should start with what you remember, she said. In spite of his nervousness, Billy found himself relaxing a little. Dr. Herrera spoke with a slight accent. Billy thought it was maybe Spanish, and the ebb and flow of her words were strangely soothing. Billy cleared his throat. I remember going to the junkyard and getting in an old car. I remember the car was being crushed. These words were what Billy heard in his mind when he spoke, but what he heard in his ears was much different. Without a tongue, Billy could only clearly use a few letters, A, B, E, F, I, M, O, P, R, V, and Y. Without distortion, some letters, A, Q, U, and X, were close but somewhat garbled. The rest of the letters, those that required pressing the tongue to the roof of the mouth in a way, weren't accessible at all. Consequently, his speech was mushy and difficult to understand. Somehow, though, Dr. Herrera managed to grasp the gist of what Billy had said. That's what I thought, Dr. Herrera said. After you were found, the police first thought you'd been attacked and placed in a vehicle compacted against your will. They had to go to your home and investigate. When they did that, they found out the truth. Billy pressed his lips together. He hated the idea of strangers going through his things. He could feel his heart rate speeding up. He forced himself to breathe slowly. At least, he didn't have to explain any more. Why am I alive? Billy asked. Well, to start with, Dr. Herrera said, dumb luck apparently. No one is sure why you survived the machine, but you did, and you were found just in time, because the junkyard owner is a bird watcher. He said he spotted a rare bird on the hood of the station wagon. That's when he noticed blood coming out from under the wagon's back door. It was almost too late. You suffered severe injuries. You had a cracked jaw, collarbone, pelvis, and your right arm and left leg were fractured. You also had internal injuries, some damage to your liver, kidneys, spleen, gallbladder. Plus, you had a collapsed lung when they brought you in. In addition to that, you had all the modifications you underwent before the compactor injuries. We dealt with your injuries and we removed all the foreign materials from your body in a series of surgeries. During that time, for several weeks after, we've kept you in a medical-induced coma to give your body the time it needed to heal. Dr. Herrera studied Billy's face. And your body has done a fine job, I have to say. Considering how much Billy hurt, he wasn't sure about that. But he didn't say anything. He was struggling to comprehend the fact that all the additions he'd made to his body had been removed. So why was so much of him still there? His memory told him that he'd been nearly entirely replaced with metal and wire plastic. Glancing down his nearly intact right hand, Billy had to question his take on what he'd done to himself. Obviously, he had been wrong, but why? Dr. Herrera shifted in her brown chair. Billy refocused on her. Some of the work you had done couldn't be undone, Dr. Herrera said. Your right leg and left arm were amputated. The exterior cartilage of your ears has been removed and most of your tongue is missing. The rest of your body, however, was integrated with the foreign material. Oddly, your left leg had been surgically altered to appear as if it had been amputated, and prosthetic materials had been incorporated with your flesh. According to the files the police found in your house, you asked the doctor to remove all your limbs, but it appears he got lazy or maybe greedy. He took your money and didn't do one of the amputations. He just made modifications so it appeared that the amputation was done. Dr. Herrera shook her head and then went on. The police raided the old mental hospital where your doctor did their surgeries, and they found body parts in the freezer. Not all were yours, but some were, including your right arm. We're able to reattach parts when they're preserved well enough. Billy looked down at his right arm in awe. Dr. Herrera smiled and crossed her legs. As for the rest, Dr. Herrera said, when it removed all of what shouldn't have been there, it came out as one coherent piece. All the extraneous parts held together with wires, and your own connective tissues and flesh. Billy winced at the idea of what must have gone into removing that from his body, and at the idea of losing even more of himself in the process. Stomach clenched. Dr. Herrera leaned forward and touched Billy's right hand. Billy thought she meant the gesture as one of comfort, but it just made his stomach flip over again. He wanted to yank his hand away from her, but he was too scared. The idea of this woman slicing him open and taking out what had essentially been cobbled together animatronic endoskeleton brought up memories of the time Billy had spent in Doc's basement. Billy couldn't contain a shiver, but Dr. Herrera didn't seem to notice it. Or didn't want to. The work that was done on you, Dr. Herrera went on, although unconscionable and gruesome, wasn't like anything I've seen. Because of that, I had put what we removed in one of our storage vaults downstairs. Dr. Herrera cocked her head. Do you have any questions, Billy? Billy had a lot of questions, but he didn't want to ask any of them. Still marveling at his intact right arm, finally managed to lift it. Straddling the line that was inserted into the back of his hand, he brought his fingers to his face. Not sure what he'd feel, he tentatively touched his cheeks. Would you like a mirror? Dr. Herrera asked. Billy hesitated, then nodded. I thought you might, Dr. Herrera said. He reached into the pocket of a white lab coat and pulled out a hand mirror. Standing, Dr. Herrera stepped forward towards the head of Billy's bed and held the mirror out in front of him. Billy took a deep breath and looked at his reflection. The last time Billy had inspected himself, what he'd seen was nothing like what he was seeing now. Gone were the hard edges created by the metal plating. Gone were the black eyes. Gone was the bare skull. Yes, Billy's ears were still missing, but other than that, he looked pretty normal. He even saw a bit of his dad in the small eyes and nose, round cheeks, and a wide mouth that he saw in the mirror. As it had when Billy was a child, Billy's brown hair was sticking up haphazardly in a variety of directions. His hair was maybe 3 inches long. Obviously, he'd been in the coma for quite some time. If the hair itself hadn't been a hint of the passage of time, the condition of Billy's scars told the rest of the story. When Billy had imagined Dr. Herrera cutting into him and taking out all the extra parts, he'd envisioned jagged incisions crusted with blood and tied with stark black thread. Instead, what he saw were faint red scars bracketing his cheeks, forehead, and jaw. Clearly, he was well on his way to healing from the wounds. Billy tried to take the mirror from Dr. Herrera's hand, but he found that his fingers wouldn't work quite right. Dr. Herrera shifted the mirror as she gestured with her other hand at Billy's right arm. You're going to be a little stiff after being out for so long, she said. You got passive physical therapy while you were out, manual movement of your limbs to keep the muscle limber and prevent too much loss of muscle mass. However, you'll need physical therapy so you can learn to use a crutch with your right arm and until your right leg is ready for a new prosthetic. Billy shook his head violently. No, he shouted. The words came out as a long, loud "oh." Billy locked his gaze on Dr. Herrera. No more prosthetics. The words sounded like, "Oh, Harry." Dr. Herrera seemed to get it. She pulled the mirror away from him and stuck it back into her pocket. She soothed. "It's okay, Billy. You won't do anything you don't want." She gently put a hand on Billy's shoulder. In spite of his fear of her, the touch felt good. Dr. Herrera backed up and sat down again. "Obviously," she said, "we had to do everything we did without your consent because you weren't able to give it." She leaned toward Billy. "Some of my colleagues didn't think we'd be able to save you, but I knew we could. And we have, with a lot of help from you." Gestured at Billy's prone form. "Your body's ability to heal has been quite extraordinary. You've come much further, much faster than anyone could have predicted, and I expect you'll get your strength back in no time. Our part is pretty much done from here on out, with some exceptions, choices about what's done to continue your healing will be up to you." Billy scrunched up his forehead. "Exceptions?" He opened his mouth to try to form the words. Dr. Herrera held up a hand. "I know what you're thinking. What exceptions, right?" Billy nodded. Dr. Herrera nodded too. He took a long breath and exhaled. "I don't want to overload you with too much right now, just a healing, but you might as well know that social services assigned you an advocate because of what the police found in your house. The state is requiring a physiological evaluation now that you're out of your coma. That's non-negotiable. But if you're deemed competent, you'll get to call the shots going forward." "You'll get to call the shots." Dr. Herrera's words echoed in Billy's head long after she left the room. What would that be like now? Billy wondered. Would he be able to make good decisions about his life? The last thing Billy remembered before succumbing to the pain of the compactor had been a crushing feeling of loss. That was why letting the compactor press down on him had felt so right, so welcome. Now Billy was being given a second chance. He could make a whole new set of decisions. He could have a new life, the life he thought he'd missed out on forever. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. Given that Billy couldn't remember choosing anything for himself that wasn't part of his animatronic delusion, he didn't know how he'd decide what to do next. But he didn't have to face that right away. He could be in the hospital for a while longer. For that, Billy was grateful. In just a short time, Billy had been conscious in this barren hospital room. It had started to feel like a welcome haven. He liked its plain walls and louvered blinds, which he asked Gloria to lower after Dr. Herrera left. Really liked the little room. But the big blue sky outside felt threatening for some reason. All that sunshiny openness was too much for him to process. A couple hours after Dr. Herrera left him, Billy got to eat his first meal as his new life. Having spent most of his life eating the animatronic diet of only white foods, he was eager to try something new. Unfortunately, the evening meal was chicken and rice with green beans. The chicken and rice were familiar and therefore unwelcomed, but eagerly dug into the green beans. They didn't taste as good as he'd hoped they would, but the red jello dessert was wonderful. In his new life, Billy decided he'd eat a lot of red foods. Can he stop with the obsession of colored food? Oh boy. The second day of Billy's new life, he met his physical therapist, Angie. One on the side of Angie's head, her hair was shorn into a buzz cut. On the other side, Her hair was long and woven into a complicated braid. Angie didn't look like she was very strong, but Billy quickly found out that she was. Angie came into Billy's room carrying an armful of bandages, a leg brace, and a crutch. "Okay, Billy," she said after she introduced herself. "We need to get you up on your feet. Or foot, as the case may be." She grinned at him. Billy laughed, but his muscles were tense. Did he really want to try to stand up? Billy's memory of being on his feet wasn't a good one. Billy remembered the way he'd careened down the sidewalk on the junkyard, where he thought he was going to die, and that had been with both prosthetics. Now he had one leg still recovering from surgery, and the other leg was completely gone. How would he stand? "I can hear you," Angie said. "I didn't say anything," Bill said. "Didn't have to. Your trepidation is written all over your face." "Trepidation is a good word," Billy said. "Glad you like it." Angie lowered the railings on the left side of Billy's bed. Earlier that morning, Gloria had removed all the lines that had connected Billy to the monitors that had clustered around his bed. "Your vital signs are perfect," Gloria had said. "Dr. Herrera says you don't need monitoring anymore." Gloria had then looked at Billy's IV. "How's your pain?" she asked. Billy thought about it. He was surprised to realize that the aches and throbs he'd felt when he'd first woken had abated a lot. He was sore, but he wasn't in agony. "Not bad," he said. "Good," Gloria said. You haven't had any meds going through this line since last night, just glucose. No, you're eating on your own, so let's get this thing out of you." He proceeded to remove the IV that had been poking into the back of his right hand. Billy was happy to get rid of that. Now that he was no longer plugged into anything, Billy could move more freely. Even so, he was wary when Angie leaned over him and said, "Go ahead and put your arm around my neck." The idea of doing this made Billy very uncomfortable. He felt hesitant and self-conscious. "Come on," Angie said. "Don't be shy. I'm tough." He grinned at him. Billy smiled. He did as she told him to do. Over the next hour, Angie got Billy sitting up, and then, after bandaging his remaining leg and encasing it in a black padded brace, she taught him how to use a crutch with his remaining arm. Between the crutch and braced leg, Billy managed to not only stand but also walk out of his room and down the hall. "You're amazing," Angie said at the end of the hour. "Dr. Herrera said you healed unusually fast. He was right." Angie helped Billy get back into bed, which was harder than he thought it would be. Maybe he'd overdone it, he thought. Some of the pain he'd felt the day before was returning. "You're probably going to be sore," Angie said. "Using a crutch is no picnic. When you get new prosthetics, moving around will be a lot easier." Billy immediately felt the same horror he'd felt when Dr. Herrera had mentioned new prosthetics. He vehemently shook his head. "I don't want new prosthetics," he told Angie. Angie crossed her arms over her hot pink cotton uniform top. "Why ever not? It'll give you a much better life." He kept shaking his head. He was surprised when his eyes even filled with tears. Angie perched on the edge of Billy's bed. She put her hand lightly on his chest. "It's okay," she said softly. Her voice was much gentler than it had been when she'd been barking orders at him while she helped him learn to use a crutch. "I get it," Angie said. "I heard what happened to you. You went through hell. And if I was you, I'd feel the same way about adding something else to my body. But Billy," Angie's voice softened even more, "before you were using the prosthetics, You tried to do something you weren't. If you get them now, you'll be using them to become yourself again. Billy pursed his lips. He understood what Angie was saying, but the idea of doing anything else to his body was terrifying. You don't have to take any action now, obviously, Angie said. But if I were you, I would keep an option open. Revisit the idea when you feel better. Billy nodded. He was too rattled to speak. Angie pushed off the bed and gave him a thumbs up. I'll be back in the morning for another torture session, she winked at him. That made Billy laugh. He decided he'd do what she suggested. Maybe sometime in the future, he'd rethink the prosthetics. Something is off about this hospital, I think. Something. I can't put my finger on it. Something feels off. Maybe it's just my bias. I mean, it's a hospital. Bad things have to happen, right? Well, it's also a horror story, so there's that. The third day of Billy's new life started with another walking session with Angie. In addition to helping him get more comfortable using crutch, Angie showed him how to raise and lower the rails on his bed. She had him practice 3 times, getting himself from the bed to the bathroom so he could use the toilet. Billy was surprised and pleased when he was able to manage that task. Not long after Angie left him, Billy had the physiological exam evaluation Dr. Herrera had told him about. That was done by a grim-faced, bald man named Dr. Coleman. Someone Billy didn't like at all. Dr. Coleman, Billy thought, didn't like Billy either. Dr. Coleman's questions were curt, and Dr. Coleman kept staring at Billy's ears, or rather, where Billy's ears had or should have been. Billy was glad when Dr. Coleman left. After Dr. Coleman was gone, Gloria came in to check on Billy. When she found him touching what remains of his ears, she looked into his eyes. Are you okay? Dr. Coleman was disgusted by my ears, Billy said. I could tell. Gloria rolled her eyes. Don't get me started on Dr. Coleman. But he's right, Billy said. My ears are ugly. Not ugly, Gloria said, just different. I need a hat, Billy said. Gloria shook her head. Billy crossed her arms and nodded. Gloria shrugged. I'll see what I can do. She winked at him and trotted out of the room. An hour later, Gloria brought Billy his lunch, a ham sandwich on pumpernickel bread and a little pile of raw carrots with ranch dip. Billy was familiar with ranch dip, but ham and pumpernickel were new to him. He liked them both. He also enjoyed the carrots. He had a dim recollection of eating carrots when he was very little. But he'd forgotten how sweet they were. Orange fruits would be good in his diet too, he concluded, and brown foods were going to be a must. Billy's desserts was chocolate pudding, which was the best thing he'd tasted so far in his new life. He loved chocolate. The second he tasted it, though, he remembered eating chocolate ice cream when he was little. How could he have gone so long without chocolate? That alone was hard to imagine. After lunch, Gloria came to get Billy's tray. Before she picked it up, she said, Close your eyes. Billy blinked, but complied. As soon as he did, he felt Gloria's warm hands against the sides of his head. Something soft came down over the top of his head. Gloria's hands went away. Okay, she said. Open your eyes. Billy opened his eyes. Gloria was holding a small mirror in front of his face. In the mirror, he saw that he was now wearing a multicolored striped hat. It's a Rasta beanie hat, Gloria said. One of my co-workers crochets them. Billy turned his head to one side and then to the other. He grinned. This is great, he said. And it was. The hat, made of fine thread, felt lightweight and not too warm, covered his missing ears, and the bright colors made him look like he felt a lot better than he did. Thank you, Billy said. Gloria patted his shoulder. "You're very welcome." She picked up his tray, waved at him, and left his room. After Gloria left, Billy kept touching his new hat. It made him smile. The hat had been a big surprise. But what happened next was an even bigger surprise. Billy started getting visitors. For the 3 years prior to the end of his animatronic life, the 3 years after his mother had died, Billy had lived a pretty isolated life. Other than Malaya, his online girlfriend for just a short time, and a couple delivery people, Billy had hardly interacted with anyone. He certainly hadn't had any friends. The new Billy, though, was going to have people in his life. This, he decided after enjoying a day's worth of surprise visitors. The first person who came to see Billy was Dr. Lindstrom. Billy hadn't seen Dr. Lindstrom since his mother had died 3 years before. Dr. Lindstrom hadn't changed much in that time, still wearing big glasses and piling her auburn hair on the top of her head in a large bun. Dr. Lindstrom's smile was wide when she rushed into Billy's room and came to his bedside to give him a hug. "I've missed you," Dr. Lindstrom said as she bent over Billy. Unable to hug Dr. Lindstrom back because she was pinning one arm to his side, her upper body, Billy just smiled and said, as best as he could, "You too." He realized this was true. Even though he'd never really enjoyed his time with Dr. Lindstrom, and she'd never seemed to like anything he'd said or done, he felt a little strange affection for the woman who used to ask him so many questions about why he wanted to be a robot. Now, of course, Billy understood that Dr. Lindstrom had been trying to help him see through his delusion. The fact that she hadn't been able to do that wasn't going to be something Billy held against her. Intuitively, Billy understood he was going to need help to get to be the new version of himself. He was happy Dr. Lindstrom might be around to help him, to give him that help. So much so that he even said as much. "I want to be a new man," Billy told Dr. Lindstrom after she took a seat in the brown chair. "Can you help me with that, Dr. Lindstrom?" The lack of tongue mangled her name, but he did his best. Dr. Lindstrom smiled widely. "I'd love to, Billy. But don't call me doctor. I won't be helping you as a doctor. You've aged out of my patient pool. I'm a child physiologist. However, I'm happy to help as a friend. You can call me Alice." Billy frowned. Be a tough name for him. Two of his pivotal sounds were ones he couldn't form. Dr. Lindstrom noticed the frown. "Oh," she said. "What am I thinking?" She waved the air and laughed. Silly me. "Call me Ahi. It will be your nickname for me." Billy grinned. He'd never called someone by their nickname before. Next hour was maybe the happiest hour Billy could remember since he was a little kid. He was sorry when it was over. But after Dr. Lindstrom, Ahi, left, Billy was even more surprised by his next visitor. Some peaceful gray clouds were starting to blot out the sun when two young men, probably about Billy's age, his true age, not his animatronic age, stepped through his open doorway. Eager to meet new people, Billy looked at the men expectantly, but he didn't think he knew them. No, wait, he did know them. "Clark?" Billy said to the shorter of the two guys. The name came out as Ark. "Hey, Billy," Clark said. He gave Billy a big-toothed grin, and Billy's mind flashed to an image of a little red-headed boy pretending to be a robot in kindergarten. Billy grinned back. "Hi, Clark." Clark was still a redhead, but he wasn't little anymore. Short, yes, but he was well-muscled. His chest was huge. "Good to see you, Billy," Clark's companion said. "Cool hat." "Thanks." "Hi, Peter," Billy said. He laughed when he realized his version of Peter's name sounded like Peter. "Sorry," he continued, struggling his way through the words he wanted to say. No tongue. No problem, Peter said. We heard. This surprised Billy. How had his old friends heard about his tongue? Peter, who was now 6'2" and lanky, with a long black ponytail, pointed a finger at Billy. You're a big deal, he said. Everyone's talking about you. Billy frowned. He wasn't sure he liked that idea. Why? He asked. Peter walked over and dropped into the brown chair. Are you kidding? You're the robot boy who survived being crushed. I'm not a robot, Billy said. It was the first time Billy had said the words out loud, and he wasn't sure how he felt about them. Part of him was happy he was no longer like a robot. Part of him, though, was lost without his robot self. Billy's body felt so strange to him now. Billy wasn't the animatronic he'd gotten used to being, and he wasn't the child he'd been before he'd tried to change himself. He was something in between the two, something that felt strange and incomplete. Peter's laughter was loud in the small room. I'm glad to hear you say that, Peter said. We're pretty far out there for a while. Pete, Clark snapped. Stepping over from the end of Billy's bed, Clark smacked Peter on the shoulder. What? Peter said in a mock innocence. He was, Looneyville. For the next few minutes they tried to one-up each other with silly names for Billy's years trying to be an animatronic. Maybe Billy should have been hurt by the teasing, but he wasn't. His friends were treating him like one of the guys. That helped him feel a little less lost and scared. After a short visit, Billy's old friends left. Before they did, they made sure he had their phone numbers and addresses. Clark and Peter were rooming together in an apartment near the local college. They were both juniors. Call us if you need anything, Clark said. We'll be back to visit you again. Peter said, maybe you can tell us what it was like to be in a robot. Clark swatted Peter again as the two left the room. Billy, who had smiled for most of the visit, felt his smile fade at the reminder of the lost years. Billy would always carry scars of this time as the would-be animatronic. Would he carry the stigma as well? Within a few minutes of Clark and Peter's exit, Billy got two more visitors. Ned and Fran, two of the people who used to deliver groceries and other things to Billy's house, came in together. Billy was shocked to see them. He was especially surprised to see that they brought a big bouquet of get-well balloons. As soon as he saw the balloons, Billy remembered the rude and dismissive way he had treated Ned and Fran. Trying so hard to be a robot, Billy had been distant and aloof, and he never tipped them. Thinking about what a jerk he'd been, Billy blurted, I don't deserve those. Ned and Fran weren't able to understand Billy, so they flagged down Gloria to help. Because she'd been talking to Billy since he'd awakened, she'd gotten used to the way he spoke. She translated for Billy as he apologized to Ned and Fran for how he'd been treating them. Both of them waved away his words. No worries, Fran said. Fran, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with brown hair cut chin length, said, we understand. She exchanged a glance with Ned. We heard about what had happened to you, and we wanted to come and let you know we care. Ned, who was shaggy blonde hair, was as tall and broad-shouldered as Fran, but much heavier, looked at his big feet. Billy had a feeling Fran might have dragged Ned to the hospital. Ned looked up. I always felt kind of sorry for you, dude. You seemed so lonely. Billy's eyes suddenly filled with tears. He blinked them away. Ned was right. Billy had been lonely. He just never let himself face that fact. He used his obsession with getting his animatronic appearance right to cover how disconnected he felt from the world around him. And despite these visits, Billy still felt disconnected. He was the guy who spent 16 years trying to be a robot. He had no tongue, no ears. He was missing 2 limbs. He also had a scar. He also had scars all over his face. Would he ever feel like he was part of this world? Ned and Fran didn't stay long. After they left, Gloria brought Billy's dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, which Billy liked a lot. He got more chocolate pudding after that, and then he got the biggest surprise visitor of all, if not the most welcome one. Billy was finishing up his pudding when he looked up and saw a short, stick-thin, stern-faced, gray-haired woman standing in his doorway, skinny arms crossed over a crisp yellow, floral blue blouse under a royal blue cardigan sweater that matched blue polyester slacks. Billy's grandma gazed at him with her small lips compressed. "Grandma," Billy breathed. The words came out as "Ra-ah." His grandma shook her head. "It's a crying shame," she said as she inspected him from head to toe. Billy dropped the pudding cup on the tray that was pulled up to his chest. The cup started to roll across the tray's laminated surface. It headed towards the tray's exit. Billy's grandma strode into the room and grabbed the pudding cup an inch before it would have fallen to the floor. Riding the cup, she leaned over to Billy and gave him a cool-lipped kiss on the forehead. The scents of vanilla and gardenias filled Billy's nostrils. He was immediately transported back to his childhood. "Time for Sunday school," Grandma said, marching into the room, shaking her head at the toys scattered across the floor. Billy's dad followed Billy's grandma into Billy's room. "He doesn't like Sunday school any more than I did, Ma," Billy's dad said. "That's neither here nor there," Billy's grandma said. "Sunday school isn't optional." "I think it is." "Did you hear what I just said?" Billy's grandma asked, extricating him from his memory. She'd sat herself in the brown chair, and she had her knees primly together. A square pink purse sat in her lap. Billy shook his head. "Sorry," he said. "No." "I said, I'm glad you've come to your senses." His grandma shook her head. "Maybe I should have insisted, but your mother..." She shook her head again. "Well, no matter. What's past is past. I'm here now." Billy wasn't sure that was a good thing, but for the next 20 minutes, he listened politely to his grandma, told him about the retirement from her job as an administrator assistant 7 years before, on her 75th birthday. "I worked for as long as they'd let me," she said. "I like to work, and though I'd hate being idle, but I found I enjoy my peace and quiet. I keep myself busy reading, baking, painting, and puttering in my garden." Billy wasn't sure what to say to the woman he remembered as a grumpy presence in his life. She was almost a stranger to him. Billy hadn't seen his grandma for over 15 years, even though she had some of his dad's and Billy's own features, the round cheeks and small eyes. She felt like a stranger to him. At the end of 20 minutes, Billy's grandma looked at her watch and stood, gazing down at Billy. She nodded once, as if reaching a decision that she didn't share. "We'll get to know each other," she said. "You just concentrate on getting well." And then she left. Billy let out a long, pent-up breath. His grandma made him nervous. But it didn't matter. Overall, it had been a good day. Billy couldn't believe he'd had so many visitors. When was the last time he'd seen this many people? Billy sat back and closed his eyes. He was worn out from the day's excitement, and he was struggling with a tangle of emotion. Although Billy's visitors had been a nice surprise, they'd unsettled him. Who was he now? He wasn't a robot anymore, but was he fully Billy? Felt like he was missing parts of himself, and he didn't know how to find them. But even with his parts missing, Billy knew one thing. He was glad to be alive. Billy had learned that hospitals weren't all that conducive to good night's sleep. Even though his own room was dark, the nurses left the door to his room open, and a sickly greenish light spilled in through the doorway. The hospital was quiet, but Billy wasn't left in peace to sleep. Every hour or two, a nurse, not Gloria, but a rotation of 3 women, so nondescript that Billy wasn't sure he would be able to describe them if he was asked to do so. Maybe would come in to take his pulse or give him medicine. On the 3rd night, though, no nurses came in to bother Billy, or maybe he was just so tired that all his visitors he hadn't noticed when they did. Billy fell asleep quickly. When he woke up, the clock on the wall above the nurse's station read 2:24 a.m. He'd been asleep for over 5 hours. So why was he awake now? Billy shifted positions on the bed, turned onto his right side. As he moved, he heard his name being called. Billy froze. He lifted his head and peered into the pukey green light that filled the hall. No one was by the nurse's station. He heard no voices or footsteps. Where were all the nurses? Billy started to settle down again, but then he heard his name again. Faint and eerie, almost surreal. Billy! A voice called, drawing out each of the letters. The sound raised all the hairs on his body. He could feel prickles on every inch of his skin, even on the skin that was no longer there. It felt like his whole body had turned into a pincushion, pierced by thousands and thousands of needles. Billy shivered as the blood began pumping through his veins faster and faster and faster. Billy! The voice crooned again. Billy sat up. Billy didn't want to sit up. What he wanted to do was curl up in a ball and pull the covers over his head. His shivers were turning into quivers that were so violent that his teeth began to chatter. But still, Billy sat up. He also reached across his body with his right hand and lowered the rail on the left side of his bed, the way Angie had showed him. Billy's name was called again. He reached for the crutch that leaned against the foot of his bed, tucked it under his right arm. Billy stood, balancing his weight between the braced left leg and the crutch. A draft from his open doorway reminded Billy that his hospital gown was flapping open in the back. He let go of the crutch and, balancing himself between his only leg on the floor and his hip against the side of the bed, he reached around with his right hand and overlapped his hospital gown, fumbling the tight enough to keep the cooler air out and his bare backside in. Sweating with effort, Billy then gripped his crutch again. For several seconds, Billy held himself still, listening. Outside Billy's room, the hallway was unusually silent. The only thing Billy could hear was his own rapid breathing. Then he heard his name again, called in the same drawn-out way, in the same hush. Billy followed it compulsively. Although Billy could get around with one leg and the crutch, he didn't do it smooth or quickly yet. The strain of using muscles that had been idle for a long time made his gait herky-jerky, and the exertion caused him to pant heavily. Billy heaved himself out into the empty hallway and blinked up at the strange green-tinged lights. They cast an unnatural glow over all the grey and white expanses that filled the hall. Billy looked at the empty nurse's station. The station was a U-shaped white desk that contained several computers and metal filing baskets stuffed with papers. 4 rolling grey desk chairs were bunched together a few feet from the desk. It had never been empty before. Billy turned away from the abandoned nurse's station and looked up and down the hall. The linoleum floor was primarily pale gray, but had a wide, dusky blue stripe ran down the middle of the hall. He had used that stripe to help him walk straight with Angie. Every time Billy had been out in the hall with Angie, it had been busy, filled with patients shoveling along with their IV stands, visitors carrying flowers or balloons, nurses rushing from one room's wide doorway to the next. But now Billy saw no one. The hospital was unusually still. Now he was out in the hallway, though. Billy realized he could hear something other than his breath. A rhythmic beeping and a whooshing sound came from a long way off. And so did the occasional scrape and thunk. And there was his name again. Billy. Billy cocked his head and tried to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. He looked down, thought the origin of the voice was under him, maybe on one of the lower floors of the hospital. Billy looked along the length of the hall again. His gaze landed on the gray metal door, the elevator at the end of the hall. He turned and headed that way. While Billy concentrated on keeping his balance steady between his legs and his crutch, as he followed the blue stripe down the hall, he asked himself repeatedly what he was doing. Why was he going towards a sound that was totally unnerving him? Nothing about the way its name was being used was encouraging or soothing. Billy really didn't want to face whomever was calling him, but he couldn't seem to resist the summons. It felt like it reached right into the core of him, tied itself to his will, and dragged him towards it. He had no choice but to go. It took just a few minutes for Billy to reach the elevator. There, struggling to catch his breath, he started to prop himself against the wall so he could push the elevator button. Before he could do that, though, the elevator door whisked open. Billy! The call still seemed to come from below Billy. It remained faint but insistent. Billy's heart rate went up even more when he looked into the empty, gray-carpeted and blue cloth-paneled elevator car. Why had the elevator stopped for him? Billy tried to control his racing thoughts. It was weird, sure, but maybe there was a reason why the elevator had stopped. Billy stepped into the deserted car, which smelled like coffee and pine-scented cleaner. He painstakingly turned himself so he could look at the control panel. The elevator doors made a sucking sound as they slid closed. Before Billy could decide which button to push, the elevator vibrated and began to descend. Billy frowned and looked up at the number above the door, watching the numbers tick down. When the L lit up, Billy expected doors to open. He hadn't pushed the button in time, so of course it had returned to the lobby. But the elevator kept going down. Now the number display read B1, B2, B3. The elevator doors swooshed open. At B3, I thought they were gonna go all the way to B7. Billy squinted against the harsh yellow light spilling into the dim elevator car's interior. The light was so glaring he didn't notice the janitor in the olive green uniform standing there until the janitor threw out an arm to hold the elevator door open. "You getting out?" The heavy-set, wavy-haired man asked as he repositioned the cleaning cart with a bucket, a mop, and several other maintenance supplies. Billy nodded, and the man stepped back to give Billy room to maneuver through the open doorway. Billy was afraid the man might ask what Billy was up to down here, but he didn't. The man's expression was blank, even sleepy. As he entered the elevator, pulling the cart along with him after Billy exited, Billy got a whiff of body odor and spearmint gum when the janitor passed him. "Billy!" Now the voice, though still slightly muted, was clearer. Billy looked down a narrow beige-tiled hallway. Unlike the wide, clean hallway on the 7th floor, this one was confined and dingy. As Billy moved away from the elevator, the hall's overhead fluorescent lights dimmed. Many of them were flickering, and they were all emanating a buzz that did nothing to mask the sound of Billy's name when it was sung out again. Billy could now tell that whoever was calling him was at the end of the creepy hallway. Billy could feel the pull of the voice even more strongly. He knew that it came from behind the closed brown metal door at the end of the hall. As soon as the door clicked closed behind Billy, he sucked in his breath and let out a small whine. Billy! Billy's gaze whipped towards one of the long cabinet's doors on the back wall of the small room. Leaning on his crutch, he lifted his right hand and wiped sweat from his forehead. Then he re-gripped his crutch and took 3 steps forward. Stopping, he once again propped himself up with the crutch. His hand trembled noticeably. He reached for the chrome handle on the cabinet door. Even as Billy grasped the cold metal, he could hear his own name, his own voice shouting at him in his head, not hampered by a missing tongue. Billy's inner voice sounded the way he remembered he used to sound, and its message was clear. No, don't open that. Billy knew why the wiser part of him wanted him to leave the cabinet door closed. He knew because he also now knew with terrifying clarity what awaited for him behind that door. Maybe Billy had known all along. Maybe he'd known the second he'd first heard his name sung. What lay inside the long cabinet, a cabinet that looked, Billy now admitted to himself, not so much like a cabinet, but more like a morgue drawer, was the other half of Billy. Even though the drawer was closed, Billy felt like he could see into it. He could see the excised part of himself, all the metal and plastic materials that he'd added, still clinging to pieces of flesh and tissue Dr. Herrera had removed from Billy in order to get all the robotic components out. This animatronic creation, which he'd worked so hard to embrace, was crying out to him, begging Billy to reclaim it. Billy, however, didn't want to take back the pieces of the life he regretted living. He wanted to move on. He wanted to be Billy, the man, not B7, the robot. It didn't seem to matter what Billy wanted, though. His hand tucked the cabinet open. Suddenly, a large hand clammed down over Billy's. The hand was hot and calloused and strong. What do you think you're doing here? A rough voice demanded. Billy let go of the cabinet door handle as if it had been suddenly superheated. He turned to look up into the narrowed eyes of a large, dark-haired man with an imposing full beard. You're not supposed to be in here, the man said. Billy wanted to slug the man for stopping him. He also wanted to hug the man for stopping him. He did neither. He dropped his gaze to the man's dark blue uniform. A nameplate on the man's shirt pocket said he was Paul, Hospital Security. Come on, Paul said, studying Billy's hospital gown and then lifting his gaze to give Billy's striped beanie a bemused look. You need to go back to your room. Billy wanted to argue, but for that, he wanted to do more than that, he wanted to do exactly what Paul said. Billy nodded meekly and began to turn to follow Paul out of the little room. As Billy turned, his gaze landed on a narrow dark gap between the long cabinet door and the cabinet's interior. Billy had imagined to open the drawer a couple of inches. It remained open as the guard ushered Billy out in the hallway. Billy's eyes shot open. He squinted into the two faint streams of light that illuminated just enough for him to make out some squat shapes. Billy clenched his fists and found his fingers curling around crisp, cool fabric, his hospital bedsheets. Billy exhaled. He was back in his room. One pool of light had slipped in through a seam in the room's shades, and another came from the hallway. It was just a sliver, barely sneaking through the slender opening of his nearly closed door. Why was the door nearly closed? The nurses always left it wide open. Billy pressed his hand to his temple. His head was throbbing, so was his leg. His expedition to the basement had definitely been more exertion on his body than his body could handle, but it had to go. The animatronic had given him no choice. Billy shuddered. Was that why he'd woken up? Had something in a dream reminded him, nearly coming face to face with the part of himself he was happy to be rid of? Had the voice returned? How much time had passed since he'd been in the basement? Couldn't have been more than an hour, not based on the darkness in his room, and his body still ached, like he hadn't had time to rest. Billy started to roll over and pulled the covers over his shoulders. He wanted to forget the trip to the little room with the long metal drawers. He wanted to click. Billy froze. The clicking sound had come from within the room. It had reached out the darkness, stretching towards Billy from a place not nearly far enough away, and it was coming even closer. Click, clickety-click, click, click, click. Under the clicking, Billy could hear slippery squelch. The sound was wet and sinister. It sounded like something hard and unyielding was oozing through something sodden. Click, swish, clickety-click, swish, click, click, click. Feeling himself, Billy shifted his weight and raised his head. He peered over his bed railing and looked in the direction of the sounds. Billy gasped. In the pale shaft of light coming from his slightly open door, he could see a dark smeared trail. The trail was made up of two substances, one shiny and dark red, and the other viscous and black. Billy breathed in sharply, and his nostrils told him that what he was looking at. He took in the rotting stench of human flesh and the bitter smell of motor oil. Billy knew exactly what was slithering his way. Maybe he'd known since he heard the first click. He opened his mouth and screamed. Grappling for his bed rail, Billy threw his leg off the bed as soon as the metal bars were out of his way. He grabbed his crutch. The second his foot touched the floor, and he launched himself from his bed a half a second after that. Billy continued to scream as he flailed towards the door. Behind him, the clicking sped up, and the slippery sounds got louder. Billy smacked the door open with his crutch and surged into the hallway, bellowing at the top of his lungs. He saw with relief that a nurse was now at the nurse's station, but he didn't stop for help. Billy knew he couldn't explain his terror quickly enough, and he couldn't risk the animatronic finding him. He hobbled down the hall as fast as he could go. Billy didn't make it very far. As he reached the corner of the hallway about 20 feet from his door, a security guard, a different one than the one who had found Billy in the little basement room, this one was shorter and balding, suddenly loomed in front of Billy. "What's all the racket?" the guard asked. Billy didn't answer him. He just attempted to keep going. He wanted to get as far away from the thing in his room as possible. The guard, however, wouldn't let Billy flee any farther. He wrapped the thick arm around Billy's waist, and then Billy started trying to use his crutch to whack the guard's leg. The guard knocked the crutch from Billy's grasp and called out, "A little help here." Weak from his time in bed, Billy was no match for the guard's strength. Even though he writhed in the guard's grasp, the guard easily lifted Billy off the ground. Being picked up fired all Billy's fight-or-flight systems. He shrieked even louder, and he twisted and churned. His panic robbed Billy of any ability to focus on his surroundings. All he could see were moving flashes of color. All he could hear were his own caterwauls. In the midst of this chaos, Billy felt something being lifted even higher. Then suddenly he was lying prone. Once he was in this position, he felt his arm being pinioned. After that, he realized he was in motion. Whatever he was lying on was rolling down the hallway. They were taking him back to his room. "No," Billy shouted. "There's something in my room." Unfortunately, what Billy said sounded more like, "Oh, omi aium." Billy tried again. "Please, don't. There's something in my room." This came out no better. "Oh, Through the confusion of movement, Billy spotted a nurse uniform. Maybe it was one of the nurses who could understand him. He zeroed in on her wide eyes, and he tried to throw her a pleading look. Either the nurse didn't understand Billy or she didn't believe him. He did nothing to stop what was happening. Hoarse and starting to choke on his own spittle, Billy stopped yelling. His chest heaved. A few seconds passed in a continued blur of confusion. Then Billy felt his body land on his hard hospital bed mattress. More chaos. Billy felt something stretching across his chest and his hips. A sting bit into his arm. More pressure. Something cold pressed against his right wrist. Then all the movement stopped. Billy blinked several times and looked around. In the light spilling into the room from the hallway, he could see that he was back in his room alone. Billy tried to move, but he couldn't. Lifting his head, he looked down at his body. They strapped him to the bed. Billy was restrained. Not only that, whatever they'd given him was starting to make him feel woozy. His head felt heavier than it should have, and it felt like the air around him was thick and spongy. Sudden drowsiness made his eyes flutter. The light from the hallway disappeared. Someone had closed his door. Now only the faintest glow came from the night light above Billy's bed. It threw out a pale yellow light that barely reached the bed's railings. Billy moaned. He squirmed, trying to loosen his bonds. "Please," Billy said to the empty room. He wasn't sure who he was appealing to, but it didn't matter. No one answered him. No one came to help. Click, swish, clickety, swish, click, click, click. Billy moaned again. The thing was still here, and it was much, much closer. "I want back in." The voice was the same one that had called Billy's name. The voice was darkly musical and raspy, distorted, as if it came through a damaged synthesizer, which, of course, it did. The last time Billy had spoken as B7, he'd used the external synthesizer in his computer. A couple days before that, though, Doc had implanted a speaker in Billy's throat. The speaker had its own synthesizer, but Billy hadn't been able to get it to work before he'd broken down and fled his house. The clicking and slippery sounds moved away from Billy's bed. They skirted into the far corner of the room and then scurried back again. "Please," the voice wheedled. "Won't you let me back in? I missed you so much. We were buddies, weren't we? You and me. We're supposed to be together. Billy lay perfectly still. He didn't respond to the voice. Something jostled Billy's bed. Stifled a gasp as he tried to raise his head to see the thing that spoke to him, but Billy couldn't make out what was clicking and sliding over the floor. Please let me back in, the voice urged again. You need me. Look what they've done to you. It's so sad. You're tethered like an animal. I can help you if you invite me back in. Come on, B7. We're better together. You know we are. Clicking got louder, and the bed vibrated again. Billy strained his neck, and there, he saw it. A vaguely human-shaped metal and plastic head rose up above the side of Billy's mattress. Billy heard a whisper gurgle in the back of his throat as he stared at bits of bloody flesh and tissue that clung to a tangled mass of metal plates and other mechanical parts. Grisly as the thing was, Billy couldn't stop staring at it as two of the plates parted and spoke again. I am your friend, B7, it said. I want to help you. Everyone in your life has failed you. No one else helped you when you were alone. They only took from you. They stole from you. They tried to control you. I just want to work with you. We're a team. Billy wanted desperately to block out its words. He wanted to cover his ears, but his hands were bound. Ghastly fleshy metal mass dropped out of Billy's view. More clicking made it clear that the thing was moving around to the other side of the bed. You know what you really are, B7, the thing said as it clicked. I only want you to be happy, and to be happy, you have to live your true life. Your true life is as an animatronic. We're meant to be together. We were designed to be as one. Billy jerked his hand back and forth, trying to free himself. He thrashed against the strap over his chest. His efforts were futile. He couldn't get loose. The remote control, Billy thought. He could call for a nurse. Stretching out his fingers, he tried to find the remote. Couldn't. It must have been out of his reach. He was helpless. Billy was having trouble staying awake, too. Whatever they'd injected him with was working its way into his consciousness. His focus was slipping away. His senses were getting duller and duller. Please, B7, the thing said. I have your best interests at heart. You have to listen to me. No, I don't, Billy thought, and he was right. Billy gave in to the fog that was filling his mind. Closing his eyes, he fell asleep. Sunlight intruded into Billy's soft grey world. The effect of it was like cold water in the face. Billy woke fully, abruptly. Asleep 1 second and totally alert the next. Billy went into a panic. Feeling like he should be alarmed, but not sure why, Billy's hand groped around and he found the remote that hung on the rail of his bed. He pushed the button that would call Gloria to him. She'd tell him why he felt so frightened and threatened. Gloria was in Billy's room within seconds of his summoning her. You poor, poor thing, Gloria cried as she trotted towards Billy's bed. I heard you. Had some excitement last night. She hurried to Billy's side and patted his shoulder. At last Gloria was still on his side. Billy was freaked out for reasons he didn't understand. but his freak-out level was dropping a few notches. "What happened last night?" Billy asked. He knew something had, but he could only hold on to wisps of images, of nightmares. Gloria moved away from the bed and reached for the pitcher of water that sat next to Billy's nightstand. "It sounds like you had a whopper of a panic attack," she said as she poured him a cup of water. She handed the cup to him. Billy at first thought he wouldn't be able to lift his hand and take the water. He didn't know why he thought that. He'd been drinking on his own for 3 days. Billy's hand came off the bed and grasped the cup of water with no trouble at all. He took a drink and handed the cup back to Gloria. Then he repositioned himself in the bed. He wasn't sure why he was so relieved that he could do that too. Billy frowned. Why did he think he'd gone through something more than a panic attack the night before? Billy left the hospital the following week. His grandma brought him home. "Last year, I fell and broke my leg," Billy's grandma said, as she walked with Billy up a long wood ramp to a covered porch stretching across the front of a small yellow cottage. "That's when I had all the ramps installed. I have to say that they make it easier to get around, even now that I have 2 legs to use again." She glanced at Billy, who was thumping along next to her with his one leg and his crutch. Lucky, don't you think?" Billy, concentrating on his ascent to the porch, didn't answer his grandma's questions. Instead, he paused and looked up at the little house his grandma lived in. Set in the middle of the wooded acre just outside town, his grandma's house was surrounded by several flower beds and many thick clusters of dark green bushes with tiny leaves. Although Billy wasn't crazy about all the flowers, they looked messy because there are too many of them, he thought. He found the bushes and the tall evergreen trees that encircled the house to be pretty. The house itself was pretty too, with a steep green metal roof and 2 dormers. The house was like ones he'd seen in magazines, places usually described as cozy or inviting. Billy supposed his house could be that. He just didn't know if he wanted to accept the invitation. But Billy followed her inside anyway and stopped in a small slate-floored entryway. The floor was covered with a yellow and blue rag rug, and the entryway's halls were blanketed with daisy motif wallpaper. Looking around, Billy remained silent. Lately, Billy had spoken as little as possible, ever since he'd been told that he was being placed in his grandma's care. Billy had withdrawn into himself, or maybe learned that he would be living with his grandma wasn't what had caused Billy's sudden desire to pull inward. Maybe there was something else. Billy had a feeling it might have had something to do with the night he couldn't remember. But then again, perhaps it didn't. Although the first few days of Billy's new life had felt exciting and hope-filled, Billy had realized that the world was way, way too big for him. Having spent the previous 16 years living as an animatronic, Billy was pretty much clueless about how to live as a man. A few days before, Dr. Alice or Ahi, had visited Billy again, and she'd explained to him that because he'd chosen to live as a robot for so long, his personality hadn't gotten to develop naturally, as most children's personalities did. He basically had lived in what his former doctor had called a mental and emotional straitjacket. "You may have some memories of who you were before you chose to live as an animatronic," Ahi had said, "but those aren't enough to inform who you are as an individual. It will take a bit of time for you to try to figure out who Billy is." what kind of person you want to be. Billy's grandma stowed her purse in the drawer of a small cabinet in the entryway. She hung up her cardigan on the mirrored oak coat rack attached to the compact bench. Turning, Billy's grandma studied him. Her gaze went to his beanie, which she'd commented on at the hospital. "Why are you wearing that silly hat?" she asked when she had picked him up. "Covers my ears," Billy had told her. "Perhaps a nice simple bandana would be better," she'd suggested. Billy had looked at her blankly. She'd sighed and let the subject go. Now she frowned, whether about his hat or his continued silence, Billy didn't know. Sighing, Billy's grandma pointed straight ahead towards a short hallway. "Both bedrooms are down that hall on the right, just beyond the living room." She gestured over her right shoulder, and Billy looked into a cramped living room, crammed full with an oversized yellow floral sofa, a large wood rocking chair with a padded green and beige striped seat cushion, a yellow wingback chair, and a simple light-colored wood coffee table, and 2 matching end tables. The room felt stuffy, not thrilled with the profusion of flowers outside. Billy was even less happy with all the flowery things inside. Besides the sofa's patterns, the room's yellow walls were covered in paintings of photographs of flowers. 2 vases stuffed with fresh flowers sat on the end of tables. Another vase filled with more flowers was perched on a thick wood mantel, maybe oak. Above the pint-sized brick fireplace, Billy couldn't imagine sitting in the room. It would feel claustrophobic. In the corner of the living room, a heavily carved wood grandfather clock guarded the space. A big brass pendulum attached to a long metal rod swung back and forth inside the clock, filling the room with a tick, tick, tick that got on Billy's nerve. No, it was more than that. The ticking made him anxious. Why? "The kitchen is that way, just through the dining room," Billy's grandma said, pointing to the left of the front door, towards the opposite side of the entryway from the living room. "You probably don't cook," she said, "or do you?" Billy knew how to cook the white foods he'd eaten as an animatronic, but he didn't want to eat those foods anymore. He figured he could learn to cook other things, but he didn't feel like explaining that to his grandma. He shrugged in answer to her question. Billy's grandma gave him a scathing look. The expression bunched up, the many wrinkles around her small mouth. Then she shrugged in return. "No matter." She stepped into the dining room, barely big enough to hold a round, dark-colored wood table, surrounded by uncomfortably looking straight-backed chairs with frilly yellow seat cushions. "Come on, I'll show you the rest. It won't take long." She led him into a galley-style kitchen with white cabinets and a yellow and green striped linoleum floor. The appliances looked old-fashioned to Billy. They had round edges and lots of chrome. Although his grandma's house was in a quiet area, and all Billy had heard outside the house were a few birds tweeting and the wind rustling the tree branches, the inside of Grandma's house seemed noisy to him. To start with, it was filled with the big clock's endless ticking. Billy could still hear it clear in the kitchen. It also had other intrusive sounds. The refrigerator's motor hummed loudly. What Billy assumed was a furnace alternately rumbled and thumped. Leaving the kitchen through a doorway on its opposite end, his grandma turned right into a small hallway and pointed at a closed door. "That's the pantry," she said. She continued on and pointed through an open doorway. "Laundry room?" Then she turned right again. Billy realized that they were coming out in the opposite end of the hallway that extended into the house from the entryway. The hall ran in a straight line from the front door to the back door next to the laundry room. They'd just done a loop. Billy realized, starting at the entryway, going around the dining room into the kitchen to end up at the back of the hall opposite the front door. A narrow flight of stairs went up to the left and end of the hallway. That leads to the second floor. Billy's grandma said, "Not much more than an attic. I use it for storage." Billy peered up the stairs and nodded. Billy's grandma turned away from the stairs and motioned for him to follow her down the main hall. Heading back towards the front door, she waved a hand towards the left side of the hall. Just 2 bedrooms, 1 bath between them," she said as she led Billy down the hall. "We'll have to share." Billy nodded again. Billy's grandma stopped in front of the first 3 open doorways on the left side of the hall. "This is my room," she said. She moved on and led Billy through the next hallway into a small room that held a double bed, a nightstand, a dresser, and a desk. The bed was covered with a plain dark green bedspread. Billy looked around. He screwed up his face at the room's walls. They were covered with floral wallpaper, tiny yellow rosebuds in a dainty pattern. On top of the wallpaper hung framed sketches of individual flowers. He tried very hard not to sigh, and he succeeded. Barely. Billy was, as Ike said he would be, still figuring out what Billy, the man, liked and didn't like. For sure, he didn't like florals. Maybe noticing the pinched look Billy probably had on his face, his grandma said, "You can change this room to suit you." She cocked her head and studied him. "But not if you intend to make it grey and filled with metal, like that house of yours." Billy raised his head and studied the room. How would he decorate it if he could choose? He wouldn't pick grey and metal again. That was B7's choice. Billy was going to have to figure out what he liked. At least he had a place to stay while he discovered his own tastes. "How about you take a little rest?" Billy's grandma said behind his back. "I'll bring in your things after that." Billy turned and looked at his grandma. She raised a severely arched grey brow at Billy. "I gathered up a few things of your belongings from your house," she said, "but then I bought you some new things too. You need color, young man." Billy immediately felt guilt. Or was it shame? Felt bad that his 82-year-old grandma was going to have to carry his possessions into the house. Billy didn't know much about how normal humans lived, but he was sure they didn't let their grandmas lift things for them. Billy, however, could barely walk around, much less carry something. Even though Billy was no longer wearing a brace on his left leg, he still had trouble balancing on the one leg and the crutch. Billy turned around again. He waited until he heard the bedroom door close, and he could barely hear his grandma's heavy footfalls. He wore heavy-soled shoes and clumped like a person twice her size. Then he turned and crossed the bare wood floor to the bed. "There," he said, and listened to the tick, tick, tick that went on and on and on. Billy might not have liked his grandma much, and he didn't like the inside of her house, but he did like what she made for dinner that night. It was red food, furthering his conclusion that he was going to want to eat a lot of red foods. "You used to like lasagna when you were little," his grandma said, as she put a thick slab of pasta layered with cheese and red sauce on a green stoneware plate in front of Billy. Billy did still like lasagna, he discovered. It was great, so great that he finally spoke. "This is really good," he said. His grandma tilted her head and quirked her lips for a second. Then she said, Thank you. She shook her head. It's going to take some time for me to understand you. He pointed at his mouth. How do you eat without a tongue? Very carefully, Billy said. His grandma barked out a gravelly laugh. It was the first time he could remember hearing her laugh. Even in his childhood memories, he hadn't been trying to be funny. It was hard eating without a tongue. He had to concentrate to make sure he didn't get things stuck in his throat. After they finished their lasagna, his grandma gave him a slice of chocolate cake. The cake confirmed what he'd concluded about chocolate. It was his new favorite thing. After the cake, Grandma asked if he wanted to play checkers. He told her he didn't know how, so she taught him. Checkers were okay, Billy thought. It was fun to play a game. Billy, however, decided he preferred video games. After the game, Billy went to his room. Grandma had left his possessions on the floor by the door. He pushed them with his crutch over to the end of his bed. There, he sat down and went through them. He didn't find much that mattered to him. His grandma had only brought from Billy's house a couple of items of his own, of his gray clothing, the vibrant colors, the shirts he'd bought to go with a couple pairs of new jeans. He made it clear what she thought of gray. The rest of what was in the box was toiletries and a few books. Billy frowned. Where was his computer? Standing, Billy went to his bedroom door. He opened it and called out, "Grandma!" Clumping sounds above Billy's head, and it came down. Then it came down the stairs. "What is it, Billy?" Grandpa asked. She had a smudge of red paint on her cheek. The red looked like blood. It made Billy uneasy. "Where's my computer?" Billy asked. His grandma shook her head. "You don't need a computer. All that digital stuff is part of what got you in trouble in the first place. That and TV." The mention of TV made Billy realize that he hadn't seen one in Grandma's house. "Where's your TV?" he asked. Maybe it was in her bedroom, and he just hadn't spotted it. She shook her head. "Don't have one. Filled with all kinds of nonsense. TV. Like that show that started all your troubles to begin with. No computer, no TV. Before you asked, I don't have a cell phone either," Billy's grandma said. Billy raised his eyebrows and stared at Grandma. "No cell phone? Good gracious, no. Infernal things," his grandma said. After she took a few seconds to figure out what he'd said. Who didn't have a cell phone? Billy thought. Everyone had cell phones. "I have a good old rotary phone in my bedroom," his grandma said, as if reading his thoughts. "That's enough for me." Billy shook his head. "I'm going to bed," he said. He needed to be alone. He needed to think. "Sweet dreams," his grandma said. She watched him make a painstaking turn. Then she looked away from him. Closing his bedroom door behind him, Billy leaned against it and shook his head. No computer, no TV, no cell phone, nothing but too many flowers and a clock that wouldn't shut up. Billy hadn't exactly lived a busy life as an animatronic, but his days hadn't been filled with silence. He'd nearly always been online when he was a robot. He'd spent lots of time on social media. He'd play online games and he'd watch hours of videos and done research on the internet. His brain had been constantly stimulated. He was going to lose his mind in his house. I'd be happier in the hospital, Billy thought. At least they have TV. Tomorrow morning, Billy decided he'd help his grandma. He'd tell his grandma he wanted to go back to the hospital. Billy wanted to go now, but he knew it was late, and demanding to be taken back tonight would be rude. Even his newly developed human self understood that. Feeling better for having made his decision, Billy slowly got ready for bed. One of the things that Grandma had bought him was a pair of burgundy red pajamas. He put those on, went out into the hall, and headed towards the bathroom. Billy didn't hear his grandma moving around. She must have been in her bedroom. But if she was, it was silent. All Billy could hear was the refrigerator's hum and the furnace's rumble and the tick, tick, tick of the grandfather clock. Billy went into the bathroom. After using the toilet, he brushed his teeth. Then he noticed he had a smudge of lasagna sauce on his jaw. The streak reminded him of the paint he'd seen on his grandma's face. Like the paint, the sauce looked like a smear of blood. Billy's hand started to shake. Trying to steady it, he reached for a washcloth and got it wet. Then the wet terry cloth slid over the edge of the sink. Billy's breath caught in his throat. Behind the slippery sound and the tick, tick, tick of the clock suddenly sounding even louder than usual, Billy's breath started coming out in little gasps. His legs went weak, and he sat down onto the closed toilet seat. I remember. He wished he didn't. Sweat beaded on Billy's forehead, and chills racked his body. Felt like someone was pushing on his chest. And go back to the hospital, Billy thought. Billy was in a hospital. B7 would find him. Billy took a deep breath and managed to find the strength to stand. Picking up the washcloth, cleaned off his face. Then he returned to his room. As Billy got under the crisp yellow sheets beneath the green bedspread, he heard a muffled trill. Billy froze and listened. The deep jangle started to repeat, but was cut off. Billy realized he was tense. He shook his head at his overreaction. It was just his grandma's old rotary phone, he realized. Billy exhaled and settled in bed. Lying back on the pillows, Billy tried to ignore the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock. He closed his eyes and blotted out the flowers looking down at him from every wall in the room. Billy might not have liked it here, but he had to stay until he had the strength back and had uncovered more of who Billy the person was going to be. He would be safer in this little country cottage, even with all its flowery and ticking. Here, he was not only far away from the hospital, he was far away from his old body, and he wanted to keep it that way. Once he decided that his grandma's house was the best place for him, Billy made a concerted effort to get used to the flower-filled home with the ticking clock. One thing Billy had learned from looking back at his life as an animatronic was that he was good at immersing himself in a role. His role now was dutiful grandson, so he put all his energy into that. Within a few days of moving in, Billy had a routine going. In the morning, he had coffee with his grandma at the round table in the dining room. He got up before dawn every morning and baked, so by the time Billy was up, about 7 a.m., there were muffins or pastries or coffee cake to go with the rich dark coffee. Eating his grandma's baked goods, Billy learned quickly that he'd been severely depriving himself of pleasure during the years he'd stuck to white foods. Then, when they sat with their coffee, Billy and his grandma rarely spoke. He always had to concentrate to eat or drink without making a mess, and his grandma liked to do a crossword puzzle in the morning paper. The silence, though strained for a couple of days, quickly started feeling comfortable, and Billy began feeling a fondness for the old lady with the perpetually sour expression. She seemed to be warming to him as well. He'd stopped making comments about his striped beanie head, and she no longer stared at his scars and missing limbs. She didn't sigh and frown around him anymore, and her quick responses to whatever he said to her indicated that she was getting used to the way he spoke. Although the grandfather clock ticking continued to pester Billy like the bothersome splinters under his skin, he started feeling better about it after his grandma explained that the clock had been made for her great, and that was one too many, I think, grandfather, as payment for his services. He'd been a doctor. It had been passed down through the family over 200 years. When I'm gone, Billy's grandma told him, I wanted to go to your dad. Right, his dad. Where is my dad? Billy asked. He hadn't thought about his dad in a very long time. After his dad had left, Billy, as B7, had found that it was best to wipe away any thoughts about his dead. It hurt less. Billy's grandma shook her head. Haven't heard from him in a year or so. Last time, he sent me a letter. He was somewhere in Peru, working for one of those companies harvesting in the rainforests. Billy's grandma sighed. He knew she wasn't happy with Billy's dad. After a couple minutes of silence, during which Billy and his grandma watched the grandfather's clock's pendulum swing back and forth, Grandma said, Anyway, this clock will be yours someday. Well, maybe I'll come to like it. Then she showed him how to wind the clock so it kept going. This became part of Billy's regular routine. He found that he developed affection for the clock. The ticking after that became more soothing than irksome. After breakfast and clock winding, Billy had other duties in the house. His grandma's baking created a lot of dirty dishes, and she had no dishwasher, so it became Billy's task to clean up the bowls and pans that she used. This was a tricky operation, given that Billy had just one hand to use and the one leg to prop himself on. But after a couple of days of getting the hang of it, he became adept at one-handed dishwashing, and his left leg got stronger and stronger. In addition to washing dishes, Billy took on dusting. He also became what Grandma called her fix-it man. When Billy had been an animatronic, he learned to do household repairs, and was adept at dealing with electrical and plumbing issues. His grandma's old house had plenty of those, so that kept him busy. In the afternoon, his grandma took a nap. While she was sleeping, Billy would sit in her rocking chair in the living room. The chair sat next to the picture window, which looked out over the front porch, and beyond it to the thick, bright foliage provided a buffer between the house and the narrow country lane that led into town. Having gotten used to the crowded living room, so much so that it felt comfy now instead of cramped, Billy sat in the rocking chair to read, but he often looked outside. When he used his foot to rock the chair, he enjoyed the way the motion calmed him as he watched little gray birds flitting around in the bushes. After Billy's grandma got up from her nap, they would have tea. Tea wasn't actually tea. It was usually more coffee or sometimes hot chocolate, and they had it out on the front porch, no matter how chilly it was outside. Fresh air is important, Billy's grandma had said the first time she told Billy to bundle up so they could sit outside and have their tea. Cold air will put color in your cheeks. Billy and his grandma sat together on the wide porch swing every afternoon. They would sip their coffee or hot chocolate, steaming in thick, squat mugs, and they'd work together unconsciously to get the swing swaying back and forth. Billy decided his body liked to be rocked. The sensation made him feel safe and relaxed. In the evening after dinner, Billy and his grandma played games. Besides checkers, she taught him how to play several other games: dominoes, Chinese checkers, Monopoly, and Scrabble. Although checkers didn't engage Billy much, he liked the rest of the games. He especially liked Scrabble. He found he was good at it, probably because of all the reading he's done as an animatronic. Grandma was good at it too. It had close matched games that they both enjoyed. In spite of the slow pace of life at his grandma's house, Billy was tired at the end of the day. He was always ready for bed before 9. Each night he'd slid under the covers exhausted. He settled in. He'd often hear, as if from a great distance, the deep ring of his mother's phone. Billy idly wondered who was calling, but it wasn't any of his business. On the first Sunday that Billy lived with his grandma, 5 days after he moved in, their morning routine changed. When Billy got up, his grandma told him to put on a good shirt and slacks, both of which she'd bought for him, because they were going to church. The idea of church made Billy think of Sunday school classes of his childhood, and he wasn't enthused about going. But he'd already learned that living with his grandma meant doing what she wanted him to do. Still, he was nervous about going to church. There would be people there, people who would stare at him and whisper about him. When Billy had been B7, he hadn't cared when other people had stared and pointed and talked about him. The fact that others hadn't understood him had been irrelevant to him. Robots had no interest in the opinions of others. Billy the man, however, did care about what others thought. Even after he started getting visitors in the hospital, Billy had been self-conscious about his scars and his missing ears and tongue and limbs. He knew that his life as B7 was something other people didn't understand. In fact, even Billy understood it less and less as the days went by. When Billy and his grandma walked through double doors into the small 100-year-old wood church with the jutting steeple and the old bell that was ringing when they arrived, Billy discovered that he needn't have worried about what people would do or say around him. Only 37 people sat in the wood pews that day. Billy counted them, and every one of them treated Billy like he was just an ordinary guy. No one stared or pointed, no one whispered about him. No one cared that he was missing pieces or that he'd lived most of his life as a robot. He was accepted immediately. The service in the little church wasn't anything like the Sunday school classes Billy had hated. No one made him memorize anything or stand up and recite anything. All he had to do was sit in the pew next to his grandma and listen to the pastor, a kind-faced man with white fair hair that flopped over one of his friendly blue eyes. After the sermon, they sang hymns. Billy hadn't liked singing in the church school and church services when he was little, but now singing surprisingly put him at ease, perhaps because of all he'd been through. When the service was over, several people came over to say hi to Billy. Everyone seemed very happy to meet him and didn't bat an eye the way he spoke. "You like to fish, Billy?" one man with a pointy goatee and a large belly asked. Billy's grandma introduced the man as Frank. She said he made the best pickles she'd ever tasted. "I don't know," Billy said. "I've never been fishing." "Well," Frank said, clapping Billy on the shoulder, "we'll have to remedy that. There's a good fishing spot not far from here that's easily accessible. I'll take you next Sunday, after church if you like." Billy didn't know if he liked fishing, but he liked Frank, so he nodded. "That'll be great," he said. Billy was practically floating when he and his grandma got home from church. He couldn't stop grinning. Seeing his expression, his grandma grinned back at him, but she didn't ask about why he was happy. All she said was, "Go change your clothes. We'll have Sunday dinner." That evening, Billy went to bed earlier than usual. The day had been good, but being around people had sapped his strength. After Billy got into bed, he closed his eyes and thought about his day. For the first time, Billy felt like he could go forward without beating himself up for the bad choices he'd made, for all the lost time and for all the damage he'd done to himself. Billy knew he still had a long way to go to understand who just Billy was, but at least he now felt like he had a clean slate to work with. Smiling, Billy rolled onto his side and burrowed him farther into the covers. Sleepiness started to quiet his mind. Just as he was drifting off, he heard the ring of the old rotary phone. Something about the ring unsettled him, but he was too tired to figure out why. As the ring stopped, he fell asleep. The following week passed the same way the first one had. Billy found that the simple, quiet days suited him more than he thought they would. On some level, he was aware that the life he was living now wasn't typical for a guy his age, but he didn't care. He didn't think he'd want to live in a country forever, but for now, it was just what he needed. It was giving him time to figure out what he did want to do. The daily routine was soothing, except for those few seconds at the end of the day as he was settling into bed. The ringing phone was bothering him more each time he heard it. Why am I concerned about it? He wondered. Was it regularity of the calls? Was it the fact that his grandma never mentioned them? But then, why would she? He wasn't obliged to tell him about everything she was doing. The second Sunday that Billy and Grandma went to church, Frank took Billy fishing afterwards. Billy learned that fishing was kind of boring, but he did like sitting in a folding chair next to a river, shooting the breeze with Frank. Billy had been a little nervous about spending time with someone he didn't know, but what would he say? But Frank was easy to talk to, an author who wrote private eye novels. Frank was really interesting and intelligent. He talked about his work in a way that made it sound like it was a lot of fun to make up characters and stories. So much so that by the time they were done fishing, Billy had decided maybe he'd like to be an author. When Billy had grown up, he hadn't thought about what he wanted to do as an adult. He was a robot. That was all there was what he was going to do. Since he'd started his new post, B7 Life, trying to imagine what he'd do for the rest of his life, or rest for his days, had been way too much to contemplate. The time with Frank, however, showed Billy a future he thought he might really enjoy. 2 limbs missing, Billy knew his options were a little limited, but he could write. What should I do if I want to be a writer? Billy asked Frank as they gathered up their fishing gear and walked away from the river. Right, Frank said. He guffawed, but then he sobered up. Seriously, kid, he said. It's a cliche, but writers write. If you want to get good at any craft, you have to practice. Just start writing. When he got back to Frank's old red SUV, Frank dug around in the back seat and pulled out a plain lined notebook. I use these. I have cases of them. Frank handed the notebook to Billy. Billy took it and ran his hand over the smooth cover. Start keeping a journal. Write whatever comes to mind, Frank said, and Billy did. Writing became as much of his routine as spending time with his grandma. His days became happily predictable, with 2 exceptions. The first exception was a good one. Every passing day, things got better and better between Billy and his grandma. Billy even discovered that his grandma had a fun side. The day after Billy went to church, for the first time, his grandma asked him to help her in the flower garden. Still not a fan of flowers, and still struggling to get around on one leg, Billy wasn't really keen on the idea, but he decided that dutiful grandsons helped their grandmas in their garden, so he decided to go along. Luckily, His grandma had little stools for them to sit on while they worked. "I don't get up and down so easily anymore, either," she said, when she brought out folding stools that had sturdy metal handles to help with getting up and down. "I've been using one of these for years," she said. "I bought a second one for you." Billy was touched by her thoughtfulness. "Thank you," he said. He sat down and learned how to pull weeds and deadhead the flowers. They worked in silence for a bit, and then his grandma asked, "What do you call it when a flower goes on a date with another flower?" Confused, Billy stopped working and looked at his grandma. "A budding romance," she said, and then she laughed her gravely laugh. Billy laughed too. He hadn't known his grandma could tell a joke. "What do you call flowers who are close friends?" he asked his grandma. She raised an eyebrow at him, her usual singed tight mouth stretched out in a smile. "What?" he asked. Billy had a feeling she knew what he was going to say, but he let him say it. "Buds," he said. They laughed together. After that, Billy started liking flowers. The second exception to the pleasurable routine of Billy's passing days was his increasing disquiet regarding the mysterious nightly phone call. It rang at precisely 9:03 p.m. The phone never rang more than twice. Usually the second ring was cut off. Tonight, Billy was getting ready for bed a little later than usual, at 9:03, when the phone rang. He was just leaving the bathroom. When the ring cut off, Billy paused and listened. For the first time, he heard the grandma speaking to whoever had called. Billy took a couple of steps towards his grandma's bedroom door. He could only just barely hear his grandma's voice. She wasn't talking in her normal tone. She spoke in a whisper that told Billy she didn't want him to hear the conversation, so Billy returned to his room. The next morning, when he woke, Billy thought about what he'd heard the night before. Already on edge about the phone calls, Billy found that his grandma's hushed tone added to his unease. He tried to tell himself that a regular phone call wasn't a big deal, but he thought it was strange that the call came at the exact same time each night. It was strange enough that Billy really wanted to know who his grandma was talking to. Accordingly, Bill decided he would time his pre-bed routines so he'd be in the hall again at the time of the call. This time, he'd try harder to listen. He tried, but he couldn't make out her whisper. Each failed attempt at eavesdropping raised Billy's anxiety. Who was calling? Why 9:03? Why the whispering? What didn't Billy's grandma want him to hear? Billy wrote in his journal about these questions, but he didn't reach any conclusion. For over a week, even as he wrote about them, Billy told himself that the calls were none of his business. He should just ignore them. One night, though, curiosity made him a little bolder. When he listened by his grandma's door instead of just standing by the door, Billy put the side of his head through the paneled wood, shifting his beanie so his ear canal was open to receive as much as possible. Billy listened hard. His grandma's whispered words were still muted to hear. She was definitely talking to someone because there were pauses in whispering, as if she was listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. Even though Billy knew it would have been wrong, he wished his grandma had a second phone in the house so he could have picked up another receiver and listened in. Something about the call's peculiar specific timing and his grandma's whispering were making him uneasy. These weren't normal just call to chat phone calls. Something was going on. Billy was becoming sure of it. But what could he do about it? Could ask, I guess. For the next couple of weeks, Billy got stronger and stronger. The residual pain from his surgeries had all but disappeared. He learned to do pretty much everything he needed to do to take care of himself. He also was starting to get a sense of himself. Felt like he was getting ready to be on his own. Billy had surprisingly enjoyed the time with his grandma, but all the writing he was doing made him realize that if he was going to become an author, he needed to broaden his horizons. He needed some life experiences. Beyond living in a country cottage, even beyond living in this town. Billy was so eager to get out into the world and explore, he even started looking into getting new prosthetics. I, who'd been coming out to visit Billy once a week, had brought him the information he needed to make his decision, and Billy had made arrangements for it. On a chilly Thursday evening, after sharing a dinner of beef stew and cornbread with his grandma, Billy decided it would be his last night with her. He didn't tell her that. He would tell her in the morning. Billy didn't think she'd be upset, even though they were getting along great. His grandma seemed like he was becoming tired, as if maybe his presence in the house was starting to wear on her. He was moving more slowly, and she was paler than she'd been when she'd first brought him home. His grandma went into her room early that night. It was fine. Billy wanted to do some writing anyway. For an hour or so, Billy wrote in his journal. By then, he was on his third notebook. Frank had brought a stack of them to church the week after they went fishing. Just before 9, Billy got up to step out into the hall. He was still determined to try to figure out what the 903 phone calls were about. So he made sure he was near his grandma's bedroom door near 902. Billy waited in the hall for a minute. When the phone didn't ring, he checked his watch. It was 903. Still waited. 904, the phone didn't ring. Billy frowned at his watch and looked at his grandma's door. That's when he realized that he could hear her talking, not whispering, actually talking. Who was she talking to? Grandma, Billy called out softly. His grandma didn't respond. She just kept talking. Without thinking, Billy reached out and grasped his grandma's door handle. He turned it and pushed the door open. Realizing he was being impolite but not caring, Billy stepped into his grandma's bedroom. Billy hadn't been sure of what he thought he'd see when he intruded into his grandma's space. His grandma talking on the phone? A secret romantic caller? Something else? Whatever that something else might have been, Billy would have never guessed it would be what he saw when he looked towards his grandma's bed. If he'd guessed, he never would have opened the door. Simultaneously, Billy's breath stopped and his heart rate tripled. For several seconds, he couldn't even move enough to inhale or exhale as he listened to his pulse pound in his ears. All Billy could do was stare at his grandma, which meant that he was also staring at the thing that had come into the hospital room and terrorized him with its exhortations to let it back in. Billy's body demanded that he take a breath. He opened his mouth and spasmodically gulped in air. The sound he made was loud in the room, but neither his grandma nor the horrible thing creeping over her noticed the noise. Accordioned into a bladed mass of metal and plastic, the thing, still stained with Billy's blood and encrusted with now dry bits of Billy's tissue, was inching its way up Billy's grandma's prone body. Every move it made emitted clicks and squelches that Billy recognized from the night in his hospital room. His grandma, dressed in her usual combo of floral blouse and polyester pants, today's in pinks and purples, made no attempt to get away from the hideousness that was attempting to fuse itself with her. In fact, she was encouraging it. That was the talking Billy had heard. That's it, Billy's grandma was saying. I know you've been alone in the dark. Been so lonely since Billy rejected you. That's why you called, right? I'm sorry I couldn't let you be with Billy again. But we've been bonding, haven't we? You don't have to be alone anymore. The conglomeration of parts surged upward and latched onto a polyester-encased leg, and part of its metal sunk into Billy's grandma's skin. Expecting his grandma to scream, Billy winced and started to rush forward, but his grandma didn't scream. She just kept talking. There was a strain in her voice, a breathiness that made it clear that she was in pain, but her words were clear. Good, she said. I'm so happy you're here. His mouth opened in shock. Billy watched as the thing completely took over his grandma's leg. No, not took over, replaced. His grandma's leg fell away from her body as the thing attached itself to her hip and kept stretching out farther, reaching upward and upward to supplant even more of his grandma. As it moved, the crimping and shifting metal and plastic continued to make its signature clicking and sliding sounds. Those sounds were the stimulus that finally got Billy in motion. Angry with himself for not going to his grandma's aid sooner, Billy started rushing towards her bed. That's when his grandma noticed him. Turning her head towards Billy, his grandma, seemingly unconcerned that her other leg was dropping away from her body, called out, Stop! Billy wanted to convince himself that she was talking to her attacker, but he'd seen enough to understand that she didn't see the thing as an attacker. Billy knew she was talking to him. Stay away, Billy, his grandma said. I want this. I'm ready to embrace this new life. Billy was unwilling to accept what he was hearing, totally repulsed by what he was seeing and compelled to stop it. No matter what his grandma said, Billy took another step. No, Billy, his grandma choked, her voice tight. Let it happen. She looked away from Billy, back down the length of her ruined body. Billy let out a mew of despair. How could he just stand here and watch his grandma possessed and mutilated by the metal and plastic creature, a creature that Billy, in essence, had created with his obsession and stupidity? Billy loathed what he'd been and what his existence had left behind. Couldn't bear to see the detritus of B7 take the grandma he'd only just come to love. As if in response to Billy's revulsion, the mechanical monster, now overtaking Billy's grandma's torso and working its way up an arm, turned a head-like metal protrusion woven from plastic projections, a tangle of wires and sharp metal plates. Two of the plates parted, creating a mouth-like gap in the continually churning parts. I want to be with you, B7, the thing said to Billy. That's where I'm supposed to be. But you wouldn't invite me back in. I sought out your grandma so I could be close to you through her. Billy didn't care what the writhing accumulation of metal and plastic had to say. What he cared about was that the thing had almost completely laid claim to his grandma. Its sharp edges were impaling his grandma's flesh, puncturing the skin between her ribs and burrowing deep into her torso. The thing was splicing open her sides, reaching past her bones, laying claim to her most vital organs. The metal and plastic invader was now almost 90% consolidated with his grandma's body. Three of her limbs had been severed. They lay on the bed, oozing blood, but not as much blood as Billy might have expected. It was like the mechanical interloper had cauterized Billy's grandma's flesh as it had usurped it. Rendered weak by the shock of what he was seeing and helpless by what his grandma had asked of him, Billy stood still. He wanted to look away from his grandma, but he couldn't. His gaze was riveted on her. That's why Billy noticed when the mass of parts started to twitch. The vibration was subtle at first, but it quickly became more violent. In a matter of seconds, the wreckage of B7 was quaking so hard that the bed's box springs squealed in protest. What's happening? Billy wondered. It almost looked like the thing was trembling in fear. Billy's grandma let out what sounded like a whoop of triumph. With her one remaining hand, she gripped onto the few metal plastic parts that hadn't yet bonded themselves to her. The parts jolted, as if trying to resist, but Billy's grandma held on. She even smiled. Raising her head to look down the length of her now maimed body, Billy's grandma said, "You understand now, yes? Well, I'm afraid it's too late to change your mind. You're stuck with me." Billy's grandma turned to look at Billy again. She kept hold of the parts that kept trying to flail away from her as she said, "I've been terminal for some time now, dear." Didn't say anything because I didn't want to worry you. She looked back down at the creature that was fighting to free itself from her. She bared her teeth in a strained grin. Our friend here, though, should be very worried. Billy felt a sob well up. His eyes filled with tears. His grandma returned her gaze to Billy. "Don't waste your tears on me. I've had a good life. I'm ready for this," she grimaced as she wrestled with the still thrashing metal plastic. "This morning, I woke up, and I knew today was my last day. I want to do this last thing." The ex-B7 creature's metal parts lashed in a clear frenzy to escape. "B7, help me," it called out. The pitiful appeal revolted Billy. He hugged himself with one arm as the thing's clicking sound came out faster and faster, becoming a rapid-fire din that filled the bedroom. The collection of metal discards fought ferociously to free itself from Billy's grandma, but its efforts weren't enough. Billy's grandma's intention was too strong. She forced the last of the bits of parts to meld with her arm. She exhaled in relief as that arm spilled away from her body. Still holding Billy's gaze, her grandma said, "Don't grieve for me. It's time for you to live. Have a good life. Be true to yourself and be kind to other people." Her face was now deathly pale. Billy's grandma swallowed and licked her lips. Then she winked at Billy. "And go to Sunday school." Gave Billy a small smile. Billy felt tears slide down his cheeks, and his grandma let out one last long exhale. She went still. Remaining rooted, Billy continued to stare at the macabre composite of his grandma and the still revolving B7 parts. The metal and plastic were moving weakly now. With every second that Billy watched them, they slowed. Finally, the mechanical monster stopped, moving completely. The clicking ceased. Billy looked from his grandma's staring eyes to the rigid motionlessness of the metal and plastic parts. He could see that it was over. Both his grandma and that what was left of B7 were dead. When it was all over, Billy wanted to just leave his grandma's house and forget he'd seen what he'd seen. He couldn't, however, leave her like that. So he sat with her for the rest of the night, and in the morning he used the rotary phone to call Frank. Frank helped Billy bury his grandma and the dregs of B7. He then drove Billy to the hospital so Billy could start the process of getting his new prosthetics. "I'll be sure her house is taken care of for as long as you need," Frank told Billy as Billy got out of the old SUV. "Thank you," Billy said, as he balanced on the crutch that he expected he wouldn't need for much longer. Billy stepped back. Frank leaned out and gave Billy a long look. "Go forth and have adventures, young man," Frank said. "You have to experience life to write something interesting." Billy nodded and lifted his hand to wave as Frank drove away. Then Billy made his way into the hospital. 2 weeks later, Billy walked out of the hospital without his crutch. He now supported his 2 new prosthetic limbs. His new arm and legs were the latest in flesh-colored, real-looking prosthetics, and Billy had gotten used to them quickly, striding away from the hospital and wearing jeans and a new bright red shirt that went great with his striped beanie, into which Billy had tucked a small carnation, a tribute to his grandma. Billy thought about the first adventure he intended to have. He'd been living with Clark and Peter while he went through the process of being fitted for his prosthetics. It had been great to hang out with them and get to know a few other guys, but he intended to stay with them for just one more night. It was time for him to get on with his new life. Not all that sure whether he was making the right choice, but feeling like it was something he had to do, Billy bought a plane ticket to Lima, Peru. He intended to try to find his dad. Both terrified and hopeful, Billy was ready to throw himself into the unknown. He wasn't sure how the trip would unfold. Maybe it would be good, maybe not. But either way, he figured he'd end up with a life experience worth writing about. And that's the end of B7-2. The conclusion to the B7 storyline. And I didn't quite expect this. But yeah, interesting story. Where the agony that he felt over the course of mutilating his body stuck to the metal and plastic and actually followed him and wanted to be with him. Or close to him, at least. This is why they went for the grandma. Yeah. Then the grandma sacrificing herself for him, I guess by dying, fused to someone, the agony also fades. Interesting. Maybe that's gonna be in a theory too. How the agony can actually be destroyed, parentheses, by simply have someone dying with it, or like infused by it, rather. Or maybe you simply need the same amount of agony to cancel it out. Because the grandma certainly felt agony being fused to that metal stuff. Oh well. Anyway, not a bad story, I don't think. Maybe a little low on the horror part. I haven't really felt uncomfortable or anything, except for that last part. Yeah, well, fine story. Anyway, see ya.